As a college freshman, I was required to read for humanities class Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, Albert Camus' The Stranger, and Jean-Paul Sartre's No Exit. Years later, I found, to my amusement, that these three literary titans had been drinking companions in Paris, and on one memorable evening in 1949, a greatly intoxicated Koestler, who was small and reputedly scrappy, had thrown a glass at Sartre and given Camus a black eye. My favorite photograph of Koestler was made the same year as that notorious late-night brawl by Dmitri Kessel for Life magazine. It is a side-by-side portrait of the Hungarian-born British writer and his magnificent boxer, Sabby. It is memorable in part because of the uncanny resemblance between the dog and his master. Boxer meets boxer. They seem deliberately to be imitating one another by the manner in which they are posing. As a result, it could be said that this portrait of Koestler is self-exemplifying, because it is indicative of what he later claimed to be the key ingredient in all innovative activity. In The Act of Creation, a book on creativity, he declared that innovation comes from, quote, the discovery of hidden similarities, unquote. Or to use the term that he himself invented, it is an act of bisociation, a process of perceiving things in two self-consistent but incompatible frames of reference at the same time. The Act of Creation was published in 1964, the year I entered college. At that time, Koestler was already famous, not yet for scientific books, but for writings having to do with his strident condemnation of Soviet communism. Darkness at Noon, his most celebrated work, published in 1940, was a political novel based on fact. It was an exposé of the purges under Joseph Stalin's reign and the nefarious use of show trials in which formerly prominent Bolsheviks were accused of trumped-up charges, subjected to public proceedings, then exiled or executed. Darkness at Noon was the best-known, most vehement anti-communist book of its time. In 1949, the year he posed with Sabby, Koestler published an ambitious book about human creativity titled Insight and Outlook. It was not well received. It sold poorly and is still not widely known today. Looking back, it was in ways a trial run for The Act of Creation, the nearly 800-page classic that would be published 15 years later. Both books espouse the same idea of the nature of innovation, but the first does not begin to achieve the clarity and eloquence of the second. The Act of Creation was a great success, and to some extent, it continues to be. In all likelihood, it remains the most often quoted and referenced book on the subject. The core concept in Koestler's book is his claim that the term creativity is erroneous, despite the title of his book. It has prompted us to misunderstand how new ideas come about. We do not literally create anything as depicted in the Old Testament. Innovations do not come about from thin air. Instead, new forms and ideas always result from recombining, shuffling, rearranging pre-existing components. To organize things in conventional ways is commonly known as association. But innovation, Koestler says, comes from bisociation. It is the product of a two-pronged associative act the unexpected pairing of previously separate components. Hence his insistence on the distinction between association, which is routine categorizing, and bisociation, by which components normally thought to be incompatible are suddenly and surprisingly linked. This takes place by a shift of attention, sometimes instantaneously in a eureka moment or a Geistesblitz, in which attributes that heretofore had been ignored are viewed with new significance. While Koestler originated the word bisociation, the idea that human invention occurs by the unexpected pairing of incompatibles was not a new idea, but it had not been explored in detail. Koestler himself admitted that his interest in the subject peaked as early as the mid-1930s when Hungarian psychologist David Rappaport challenged him to explain the function of a joke in Henri Bergson's book on laughter, published in 1900. 5 years after Bergson's book, Sigmund Freud had published a volume about jokes and their relation to the unconscious, in which he said that humor was typically tied to the ability to find similarity between dissimilar things, that is, hidden similarities. As one example, he suggested that raucous celebrations could be called alcoholidays. He does not mention his own use of cocaine. Freud's book came out in the year of Arthur Koestler's birth. Long in advance of Bergson and Freud, humor and wit had been commonly said to be a marriage of previously incompatible pairs. Later, Koestler alluded to that when he described bisociation as an unlikely marriage of cabbages and kings, of previously unrelated frames of reference or universes of discourse whose union will solve the previously unsoluble problem. In that passage, he also referred to the famous comic lines in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland books when Tweedledee tells the story about the walrus and the carpenter. It begins like this. "The time has come," the walrus said, "to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot, and whether pigs have wings." In addition, Koestler was no doubt acquainted with one of the most celebrated political cartoons in European history. It is an 1834 caricature of King Louis-Philippe of France by Charles Philippon. It takes the form of a series of steps, a metamorphic or evolutionary sequence in which the king's head, which his distractors had often compared to a pear, convincingly evolves into a comically corpulent pear, a pear head or a fat head. As a result, that famous cartoon is all but a literal prototype of Koestler's betrothal of species. While not a marriage of cabbages and kings, it is a marriage of kings and pears, a commingling of heretofore different bloodlines, royal and fruit. That caricature also brings to mind a one-liner from comedian Henny Youngman. "Did you hear that they crossed a mink with a gorilla? They got a nice coat, but the sleeves were too long." Or, in equal measure, it calls up Robert Williams Wood's book of hilarious verses and drawings that comically claimed to show how to tell the birds from the flowers. There is another well-known book from the same time period titled What a Life, in which British authors E.V. Lucas and George Marrow used advertising images from a London department store catalogue to pretend to tell the story of a man's life, but the images and their captions are intentionally mismatched, so that an electric iron is mistakenly said to be an animal at the zoo, and a clothes hanger for a jacket and trousers is misidentified as a game of leapfrog. According to Koestler, humor in all of its various forms is rooted in mock confusions like these, which may lead to bisociation. In one form or another, it is often delivered through bait and switch. The audience is baited or led to believe that a particular train of thought is in play. And then, abruptly, as a result of the punchline, a disarming switch of attention occurs, and a momentary confusion erupts. The effect is a double awareness in which A is A, while at the same time, A is also not A. In performing bait and switch routines, it is customary to feature a pair of comedians, one of whom, known as the straight man, is the person who sets up the pattern, the bait, for the audience. The second person ignites the laughter in the process of airing the punchline. In Abbott and Costello, Bud Abbott is a straight man, while Lou Costello makes the pretended confusions. In Burns and Allen, George Burns is a straight man, while his partner, Gracie Allen, is the sort crosser. Sancho Panza is the straight man in Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote. In Mr. Magoo cartoons, Magoo's impoverished eyesight leads him to mistakenly think that A is not A, while Waldo provides the conventional view. In the case of Sherlock Holmes, it is the insightful detective whose cleverness takes us by surprise, while Watson underscores the norm. To use a pair of performers may be convenient, but it is not a strict requirement, since the derailment of trains of thought can be produced by other means. When a single person tells a joke, it is common to set up a pattern of expectation using two normal examples, then break that pattern with a third, which functions as the punchline. But that too is non-essential, since the audience is most likely well aware of what is normal, in which case they themselves can function as the straight man, and the comedian only needs to provide the punchline. It does not require two people to say, "I took my dog to the flea circus and he stole the show." Or, as Groucho Marx exclaimed, "One morning I shot an elephant in my pajamas. How he got in my pajamas, I don't know." All these are pretended confusion or sorting mistakes requiring double awareness. Gregory Bateson referred to this as translogical thinking, while Colin Turbane called it sort crossing, as distinct from conventional sorting. Turbane also distinguished it from genuine errors or category mistakes, which he called sort trespassing. At the same time, it is important to note that bisociation does not always end up as humor. Among familiar examples of this is poetic metaphor, in which one thing is knowingly referred to as if it were some other, usually different thing. This has prompted various authors to say that innovation could be called metaphorical thinking. Aristotle was among the first to point this out when he said that the greatest thing by far is to be a master of metaphor. It is a sign of genius because a good metaphor implies an intuitive perception of the similarity between dissimilar things. Thus, Humor was not the intention when the poet Sophie Tunnell wrote that fear is a slinking cat I find beneath the lilacs of my mind. Or when Carl Sandburg famously said, "The fog comes in on little cat feet." Or when Cynthia Ozick described a certain character as having a pocket mirror of a face. Perhaps the greatest achievement of Koestler's The Act of Creation was his persuasive assertion that bisociation is not merely the basis of humor, but of all forms and varieties of innovation, of creative activity, if you will. All innovation arises from wit, Koestler claims, in the sense of insight and inventiveness. Whether comics, scientists, or practitioners of the arts, all of those who innovate live by their wits. To clarify this, Koestler designed a diagram made of 3 vertical columns, each of which lists a few of the forms that make use of bisociative thinking. It is a widely inclusive proposal, and it is easy to see why his attempt to explain it required nearly 800 pages. In the modern era, among the most striking examples of non-humorous bisociation can be found in public service posters produced by British graphic designers around the time of World War II. There was one designer in particular who was especially skilled at this. He was Abram Games, and these are 2 of his wartime posters in which he wanted to persuade the British public to grow their own food instead of relying so heavily on overseas shipments from allies, which were being blocked by enemy ships. The one on the left makes powerful use of a bisociative merging of a spade and a supply ship on the opposite side. The poster's 2 halves are purposely designed to rhyme, and the lines of type are also aligned. At the same time, the 2 sides are also made to contrast by differences in color, texture, and the waves that contrast with the vertical ground. The second poster on the right is from the same public service campaign, but now the bisociative link is made between the rectangular dining table and the garden plot beneath it. The pitchfork and spade that serve as the legs of the table are continued on the tabletop by the fork and knife for eating. The matching diagonal placements of the table and the garden plot ensure their strong connection. The designer's most reliable tactic is his use of visual puns, in which 2 different components are made to rhyme using visual similarities, while also remaining distinguishable. That approach is clearly evident in each of these 3 posters. On the left, the circular control knobs on an instrument are made to function also as the 2 O letters in radio location. In the poster in the center, there is a cartoon drawing of an enemy soldier's head, including his helmet, embedded in the facing end of a military hospital bed. And in the poster on the right, the rifle barrel at the top is purposely made to line up and to rhyme with the question mark, which is itself the trigger of the gun at the bottom. In its emphasis on jokes as exemplary of invention, Koestler's theory runs the risk of not being taken seriously. Fortunately, throughout his book, he was able to document examples of bisociative discovery in the history of science. It has long been claimed, for example, that the Greek philosopher Pythagoras came to realize the connection between music and mathematics as he was visiting a blacksmith shop and noticed a correlation between the lengths of metal rods and the auditory pitches made when struck by various hammers. Equally well known is the discovery by Archimedes, while engaged in the routine of taking a bath, of the unforeseen connection between the volume of water displaced by his body and the volume displaced by immersing a crown. At the moment of his discovery, he is said to have burst out with the scientific equivalent of a punchline. Eureka! I have found it. To which Chico Marx replied, You don't smell so good yourself. In our own time, among the most famous examples of bisociation in science is the invention of the hook and loop fastener, commonly known as Velcro. It was developed over many years by a Swiss scientist named George de Mestral. The idea initially came to him in 1941 in the process of hunting in the Swiss Alps with his dog. Returning home, he was annoyed to find that the dog's fur and his own clothing were covered with burrs from cocklebur plants. Instead of dismissing the experience, when he examined the burrs under a microscope, he found that they consisted of tiny hooks that easily attached to loops, such as on clothing or animal fur. The resulting invention functions by the interlocking of tiny nylon hooks and loops. Before I became a university professor, I taught briefly in a public school. One day, in a class of 7th grade students, I came prepared to talk about usually unnoticed connections between familiar objects and, in particular, about skeletal structures. I brought with me to school that day various examples of medical x-rays, a plastic model of the skeleton of a mastodon, and the balsa wood wings of an unassembled model airplane. I displayed these on a tabletop in preparation for my talk, but I was then distracted by some other event in the classroom, and I briefly turned aside. When I returned to the table, I found, to my surprise and great delight, that one of the students had spontaneously attached the airplane wings to the skeleton of the mastodon. I was so pleased by this invention that I permanently mounted the wings, added a wooden base, and painted the hybrid construction. Obviously, a new idea had taken flight, and the title I later chose for it was The Mammoth Flyer. It appealed to a wide range of people, as was confirmed a few years later when it was stolen from an art exhibition. Almost a decade ago, New York writer Maria Popova wrote an online essay about Koestler's The Act of Creation. She described it as fantastic and said that it will change the way you think about everything, including thinking itself. Although I first read the book a half-century ago, when it came out in the 60s, I can attest to its lasting influence on me. More than anything else, it prompted me to realize that to wait for fortune to arrive is literally counterproductive. If nothing else, as physicist Henri Poincaré said, fortune favors the prepared mind. And in the process of innovating, a prepared mind is one that is well stocked with flotsam and jetsam, and is willing and eager to partake in what Albert Einstein once described as combinatory play.